Uttayeti vishavirya vilola jihvam. Uchatayishyad uragam viharan haradinyam. Please repeat. Yet, one who, why, certainly, Vraje at Vrindavan, Vrajabhashun, the animals thereof, Vishatoya, poisoned water, Pitan, those who drink, Palan, the cowherdmen, two, also, Ajivayat, brought to life, Anugraha Drishti, merciful glance, Vrishtya, by the showers of, Tat, that, Shuddhaye, for purification, Ati, exceedingly, Vishavirya, highly potent poison, Vilola, lurking, Jivham, one who has such a tongue, Uchatayishyat, severely punished, Urugam, unto the snake, Viharan, taking it as a pleasure, Radinyam, and the river. Translation by His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai. Then also, when the cowherd boys and their animals drank the poisoned water of the river, Yamuna, and after the Lord and his child had revived them by his merciful glance, just to purify the water of river Yamuna, he jumped into it as if playing and chastised the venomous Kāliya serpent, which was lurking there, its tongue emitting waves of poison. Who can perform such Herculean tasks but the Supreme Lord? There's no purport to this, so I'll go on to the next verse, which also has a purport. I'll read the Sanskrit myself. Tatkarma divyam ivaya yannishinishayanam davagnina shuchivane paridayamane unnishyati vrajam mato vasitantakalam netri pidapya sabalo nati gamya viryaha. Translation: On the very night of the day of the chastisement of the Kāliya snake, when the inhabitants of Rajabhumi were sleeping carefreely, there was a forest fire ablaze due to dry leaves, and it appeared that all the inhabitants were sure to meet their death. But the Lord, along with Balaram, saved them simply by closing his eyes. Such are the superhuman activities of the Supreme Lord. Purport: although in this verse the Lord's activity has been described as superhuman, it should be noted that the Lord's activities are always superhuman, and that distinguishes him from the ordinary living being. Uprooting a gigantic banyan tree or Arjuna tree and extinguishing a blazing forest fire simply by closing one's eyes are certainly impossible by any kind of human endeavor. But not only are these activities amazing to hear, but in fact all other activities of the Lord, whatever he may do, are all superhuman, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Whoever knows the superhuman activities of the Lord, due to their very transcendental nature, becomes eligible to enter the kingdom of Krishna. And as such, after quitting this present material body, the knower of the transcendental activities of the Lord goes back home, back to Godhead. Om Agyana Timarandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmiritam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Mano Bhishtam Stapitam Yena Putali Swayam Rubakata Mayam Dedati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Tapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamshta Shri Rupam Sagarjatam Sagararaganatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shivashakan Vitamshta He Krishna Karuna Sindhudina Banu Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanda Radha Kantan Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhi Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranama Mihiri Priya Vansha Kapatyo Vyasha Kripasandu Bhiyapacha Patitanam Bhavnebhyo Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namaha Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Putalesh Mati Bhakti Vikasa Swami Nitinamane Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Putalesh Mati Bhakti Vinata Swami Nitinamane Namaste Sarasvati Devi Gauravani Pisharne Nirvishesha Shunavari Paschatya Tishtadharne Puter Mahadbiri Mafur or Vivor Nirdamaya Shitya Amusha Purasha Bunkni Gunan Shurasha Shodasatmaka Sodankrishishta Bhagavan Vachamsime. So I was just reading, I was just thinking of reading this first one. This first verse is mentioned here that anugraha drishti vrishtya, that the Lord ajivayat, he brought them to life by his merciful glance, the cowherd boys who had left their body, and as well as the animals. So the devotees are always eager to attract the glance of Krishna, because that glance is life-giving. Actually, it literally gave life to the cowherd boys and the poisoned residents of Vrindavan who were actually dead, and Krishna revived them. Simply by Krishna's glance, the whole material manifestation is brought to life, actually. Otherwise, it's just dead matter. I was thinking that when I read that for the first verse. As far as the second one goes in the purport, so these topics are on Krishna, and Srila Prabhupada naturally, well, this comes in the Sanskrit of the second one, karma divyam. That, and of course, Srila Prabhupada naturally, he quotes Janma karma chame divyam evam yo veti tattvataha, etc. That simply by knowing Krishna's transcendental birth and activities, then one is assured of going back home to Godhead. And his purport to that verse, Srila Prabhupada writes that simply by having faith that all of activities, Krishna's activities are transcendental, one is assured liberation, and one is assured that he will go back home, back to Godhead. So, this is one of Srila Prabhupada's most quoted verses, this Janma Karma, probably the second or third most. And he will constantly make the point that we should, quoting a relation that we should understand, we should know about Krishna, we should know about Lord Chaitanya, we should know their pastimes, we should know their activities, we should know who they are, and we should know that everything they do is transcendental. As Srila Prabhupada he says here, although it's the second canto of the Bhagavatam, it's in the latter half of the second canto, it's almost over. Already the first canto is such a large book, there's so many purports there. But again, Srila Prabhupada is re-emphasizing the same thing he's emphasized throughout the first canto, with the idea of hammering it in, that all of the Lord's activities are transcendental. So we should know this very well, and we also should know his activities. It's very important to know the activities of Krishna, to know who he is, what he does, what he likes, who his associates are, etc. And we should know about Lord Chaitanya too. What he does, who his associates are, what his pastimes are. Often it's found that devotees are in the movement 2 years, 3 years, to get initiated, and they don't know anything about Lord Chaitanya. It was a case with myself, actually, because I read Bhagavad Gita, and then I read some other books, then I started Srimad Bhagavatam. And, I mean, the purports are there in the Bhagavatam, and that's there, but I hadn't read teachings of Lord Chaitanya or Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I didn't know that book existed at that point. And so all that time, I was reading about Lord Chaitanya. I mean, philosophically, that's there, understanding the philosophy of Lord Chaitanya, that's there, but going on like that, I didn't know anything about Lord Chaitanya. It's very important, actually, because we're practicing aspiring Vaishnavas and the Gaudiya Sampradaya. Gaudiya Sampradaya specifically means, and the line of Lord Chaitanya. It's very important to know not only what he taught, to know. It's just like if you're to follow a person, as a natural thing, if you claim yourself as a follower of a person, you should naturally know what they're about, It's like if you're some political candidate, should know what their background history is, what they do, what their platform is. So similarly, we should understand the philosophy of Lord Chaitanya. Krishna's philosophy is given in the Bhagavad Gita, but we should also understand them as persons. Otherwise, it may become something dry. Just studying philosophy without actually getting... Krishna says this, specifically in the Bhagavad Gita. Of course, that's there... Maya Sakta Manaf Partha Yogam Nyunja. Simply by hearing from Krishna, what's spoken from Krishna's lotus mouth, that's also there. But this is also there. Janma karma chame devyam, that my transcendental birth, my appearance, and my karma meaning activities here. As well as in this verse, Srila Prabhupada translates it the same. Tat karma devyam, that divine activity, that superhuman, he gives the translation here. So we have to understand what are Krishna's activities, what does he do? Just learning philosophy without understanding Leela, or not necessarily understanding. Understanding is also there, but without reading about Krishna's pastimes, without reading about the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya, it can become somewhat dry. It's something like studying grammar, but not speaking the language. So similarly, we have to study both things in tandem. We have to know, we should study the philosophy very thoroughly. We should also hear the pastimes. Therefore, books like the Krishna book is there. The opposite is the same. Srila Prabhupada would often emphasize that as the same thing, if you try to speak a language without knowing any of the grammar, you will just screw it up. So similarly, there's a lot of people who know something about Krishna, but they have no idea. You can also read the 10th canto directly, and the Chaitanya Charitamrita is also there in due course of time in our reading. But the essence is we should know there's Janma Karma Divyam. We should actually know it. It's not just something we speak about and something that Prabhupada quotes that we quote. We actually have to do it. And the Chaitanya Charitamrita, it said, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, he famously writes, quote, men become strong and stout by eating sufficient grains, but the devotee who simply eats ordinary grains but does not taste the transcendental pastimes of Lord Chaitanya and Krishna gradually become weak and falls down for the transcendental position. However, if one drinks but a drop of the nectar of Krishna's pastimes, his body and mind begin to bloom, and he begins to laugh, sing, and dance. So it's very important. Famously, Srila Prabhupada, he purported to this verse that all the devotees connected with the Krishna consciousness movement must read all the books that have been translated, Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, and others. Otherwise, after some time, they will simply eat, sleep, and fall down from their position. Thus, they will miss the opportunity to attain eternal, blissful life of transcendental knowledge. So hearing of the books is hearing of the philosophy and reading Srila Prabhupada's books is very important. This warning that's given by Srila Prabhupada in this purport, it can be, it's meant, he wrote it, presumably with individual devotees in mind, but the same warning can be extended to societies and spiritual movements as a whole, and temples as a whole. If a body of devotees aren't reading Srila Prabhupada's books, if the members of a community or movement don't regularly read Srila Prabhupada's books, that movement or community will relapse into a state of, inertia, lethargy. In other words, it would decline, just as devotees would gradually fall down from their position. So similarly, too, that institution, that community, that temple will also decline. The devotees aren't regularly versed in Srila Prabhupada's books, regularly reading them. Srila Prabhupada ordered that you should read my books thoroughly every single day. And he writes, one other quote, the Guru is writing books. If you think there's no necessity of reading books, that is Guru Avagya. So, My own spiritual master, he writes in, I forget, these 100 prayers by, do you know that? What's that? 100 Prabodhananda Saraswati? Vivek Shatatam. Shatatam? Like that? Anyway, it's 100 prayers by Prabodhananda Saraswati. He writes the same thing, that the previous acharyas, they've written works, not, or the idea that they're meant to be read, they're meant to be taken advantage of. And to not take advantage of those instructions, those literatures they've read is Guru Avagya. Neglect, Guru Avagya, you can take it as disobedience to, but another translation that is given is neglect of the order of the spiritual master. It's just like if the spiritual master says something, you don't do anything about it, or you don't take care to even hear of it, it's considered neglectful. It's just like, if you have a child and you just leave the child in some place, as considered neglect. So similarly too, if the spiritual master is giving instructions, then instruction isn't taken advantage of, as considered neglectful. Even if we don't like to do it. Srila Prabhupada said that tapasya is required to read Krishna's instructions, Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, and to try to understand Krishna. Because that is tapasya. If you take a little painful, it's not very painful, it's very pleasing. But we avoid it. We think it's painful. Who is going to read books? We are meant for selling books, not for reading books. This is not good. We should read also. That is tapasya. Don't think that our books are meant simply for selling. No, it is meant for reading also. If you read regularly, at least 2 hours, 3 hours, that is tapasya. So even if you don't like to read the books, you should read the books at a sense of tapasya. Presumably, at least when we first take up the Krishna consciousness, the idea of following the 4 rules and regulations and even chanting 16 rounds, it may appear very unpalatable. It may appear like a very, just like this, tapasya is austerity. So similarly too, it's not austerity, it's a basic form of human life to refrain from sex life, and actually sex causes so much suffering, what to speak of intoxication. Now that when you start to follow these things, then you can see these things. But when you don't follow these things, you don't understand it. You think it's like nectar. So similarly too, if we're not accustomed to reading, we think it's like poison, but actually what's in those books is complete nectar. I don't have the Bengali quote, but Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami uses that word in reference to Lord Chaitanya's pastimes and Krishna's pastimes. They're nectar. Elsewhere, Mahotsa Prabhu, he knows this verse. It's like something Amritapur. The two are compared to sweet rice and camphor. And when you mix the two, a very palatable taste comes. But sometimes it may be experienced that we don't want to read. We're not really so fired up about it, or the mind is telling us we've heard this before, but Srila Prabhupada is saying that we should read, even if there's not attraction, as a form of tapasya, because by reading, taste will come about, just like we quote, I don't know the full verse off completely, Sat Krishna Nama Charitati Sitapi Avidya. It's like jaundice, but by eating sugar candy, jaundice is cured. Similarly, too, by hearing the pastimes of Krishna, this jaundice of the tongue will also become cured. No. What is that? No, that's a different verse. That's Narochikanu, Kintvadurad Dinam Kalusaiva Jashta, Tadgulamudahantri. It destroys it at the root. So we should hear, in other words. We should hear. By hearing, not only do we taste the nectar, we remove the jaundice, we taste the nectar, and we go back to Godhead. So everything's there. So there are so many different, Krishna has so many different pastimes. There's Krishna's pastimes, Lord Chaitanya's pastimes. There's all the pastimes of his different incarnation avatars. And there's the pastimes of his devotees. Srila Rupa Goswami, and the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Nectar of Devotion, he lists the 64 limbs of devotional service. And at the end of it all, he says, these 64 limbs, although applied to the personality of Godhead, they also apply to the devotees. So hearing about devotees, chanting about devotees, serving devotees, etc., is as valuable, in fact, it's more valuable than in relation to Krishna. It's more valuable to serve the devotees of Krishna than it is to serve Krishna. Hearing, I can't comment on, but at least the service is there. It's also valuable to hear about the devotees of Krishna. So hearing about the pastimes of the devotees of Krishna, just as Srila Prabhupada's appearance day was just recently, hearing about the pastimes of Srila Prabhupada. But generally, it's taken that hearing, and throughout, Generally, for specifically Gaudiya Vaishnavas, the topics are Lord Chaitanya and those topics given in the Bhagavatam. And the crest jewel of those topics to hear about is Krishna's Leela in the 10th canto. In the 3rd canto, this is referred to as Paramam Stitam, the highest position you could translate as. This Maitreya, Vidura was inquisitive to know this knowledge, and he approached Uddhava, because he knew Uddhava had received this knowledge from Lord Krishna before he left this world. This knowledge, and what is this Paramamstitam? Is just knowledge of Krishna's pastimes out of Vrindavan. This knowledge is the highest, most confidential knowledge that's given in the Bhagavatam. Even when Lord Brahma, as we're coming up in 2 chapters, I think, when Lord Brahma or Lord Krishna spoke the Chaturshloki Bhagavatam to Lord Brahma, if you look at those verses, there's nothing about his pastimes in Vrindavan. Lord Brahma didn't receive any knowledge, at least at that time, about this Paramamstitam, this highest position, this most confidential knowledge of the Bhagavatam. But Uddhava did before Krishna left this world. So devotees are naturally inquisitive to that's also there. Devotees are naturally inquisitive, but they should be. That's the highest topic of discussion, this 10th canto that's given. Srila Prabhupada summarized as Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, interspersed with philosophy. In the Bhagavatam itself, it does this. I couldn't find the quote offhand, but Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he says that the Bhagavatam is presented in such a way that gradually, Srila Prabhupada would make the same point in a different way, gradually you come to the pastimes of Lord Krishna, not immediately. Actually, immediately there's some in the 1st canto, some things are there. It's kind of like a, what is that, like epilogue or like an, how to say, not introduction, it like comes after the Mahabharata. It's wrapping up some of the things that are given in the Mahabharata of the war, battlefield of not Kurukshetra, but the whole activities that have taken place in the Mahabharata. And so the 1st canto sort of wraps those things up. But the Bhagavatam, it presents Krishna's pastimes, but it also intersperses it with philosophy, different stories, different incarnations, different narrations of devotees. And this is deliberate. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he says, there's some technical term he uses for this. I couldn't find it offhand. But you see this, if you study the cantos of the Bhagavatam, the first, let me think. Does anybody know, can anybody say where Krishna's pastimes in the Bhagavatam are first come in to play? Don't take the first verse, don't take creation. I'm talking about 10th canto pastimes, out of Vrindavan and like that. Does anybody know where they first come throughout the Bhagavatam? When they're first mentioned, and just like the 2nd canto verse is mentioning pastimes out of Vrindavan, yeah, specifically Vrindavan. It comes in the 1st canto, actually. There's Queen Kunti. There's one verse she prays, Gopiyadade tvai karita gasidamatavad, yete dashashu kaninanjanam sampramaksham, vaktram ninya bhaya bhavanaya stitasya, samam vimoheti bhir abhiyad bheti. So she prays, the paraphrasing, I don't know the exact thing. My dear Krishna, Mother Yashoda, she took up a rope to bind you, and you ran away crying in fear, although you were feared by fear personified. So our acharyas, they comment that this is the first verse in the Bhagavatam that mentions Krishna's pastimes of the Vrindavan, and this verse, our acharyas comment, is actually a seed verse for Krishna's pastimes. And they come into a full blossom. There's one verse, it comes into full blossom in the 10th canto. Although it's also mentioned elsewhere, just like this 2nd canto now, we're also reading this 7th chapter, Scheduled Incarnations. Of course, Scheduled Incarnations, but also Krishna's pastimes are coming here. So similarly to the 3rd canto, just as I was mentioning, Vidura approached Maitreya, wondering about these pastimes, and they're given in even more detail. So you see, first, there's some glimpse that's given in the 1st canto of Lord Krishna's pastimes. Then 2nd canto, there's a little more elaboration here. 3rd canto is given even more elaboration. And then practically from the 3rd canto all the way to the 10th canto, there's nothing about Krishna's pastimes. Directly. It's all other incarnation, other devotees, Lord Nrsimhadev, Kapiladev, etc. like that. There's a long gap before anything directly about Krishna is discussed. Of course, Srila Prabhupada mentioned his purport, practically every purport, Krishna is there. But as far as the Bhagavatam itself, it's not until the 10th canto that Krishna's pastimes come into full fold. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he said this is deliberate for the upliftment of the fallen conditioned soul. So the 10th canto, naturally, is the smiling face of Lord Krishna, and the most confidential part, the most, I guess you could say, elevated part, the Rasa Lila, Srila Prabhupada likened it to the smiling face of Lord Krishna. But even too, at the end of the 10th canto, following that, the 11th canto is so densely packed with philosophy, and so deliberately so as to not misunderstand the topics of the 10th canto. So the Bhagavatam is presented in a very systematic, and then everything is recapped in the 12th canto. So the Bhagavatam is presented in a very systematic way, ultimately elevating conditioned souls up to the highest point of understanding Krishna's pastimes in Vrindavan, and for good followers of Lord Chaitanya, those specifically taking those pastimes of Rasa Lila, those Madhurya pastimes, as topmost. So Srila Prabhupada came specifically to give these topics. He came to the West to teach people about Krishna, teach people this Janma Karma Divyam, these divine activities of Krishna, and specifically, as a follower of Lord Chaitanya, just like Lord Chaitanya came to give this Unottajvala Rasam, Svabhakti Shriyam, this most elevated mellows of devotional service and devotional service unto him. So similarly, his followers, his pure devotees, they give the same thing. Srila Prabhupada similarly too came, his presentation of Krishna consciousness is done in such a way to elevate us to the most, and to the highest topics of Krishna's pastimes. As I've mentioned, he gave teachings to Lord Chaitanya. Most of us here have read that. And it's a pretty high book. He wrote that in 1967, published it in 1968. I mean, at that time, practically his disciples knew nothing about Krishna consciousness. In 1968, it began work on Nectar of Devotion. 1970, I think he published that along with Krishna book. So very early on in Srila Prabhupada's movement, he gave pretty high books. And in teachings of Lord Chaitanya, he mentioned topics that even Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he forbade his followers to read. So in some ways, it was quite liberal with these things. In some ways, it was more circumspect. And not only that, did he give, again, he gave Chaitanya Charitamrita in full, for those of us who have read, which goes all the way up to the pinnacle of devotional service. And not only did Srila Prabhupada give these things, he insisted that these books be widely distributed, especially, everything, teachings of Lord Chaitanya, Chaitanya Charitamrita, back in the day, devotees were distributing individual volumes of the books. And of course, Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The first book, Srila Prabhupada distributed himself, the first edition, the actual first copy of Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So he insisted that these books be distributed widely, and he encouraged devotees, particularly early on in the movement, new devotees to develop loving feelings for Krishna, Raga. You see, if you hear the early lectures of Srila Prabhupada, he will encourage them to develop some feelings and emotions, some attachment for Krishna. Yet he would, this was there, but all of this was based on pure selfless service to Krishna, or that's unmotivated without any interruption, ahituki pratiyata, anyabhilashita shunyam, etc., like this. It is devoid of any tinge of material desire. So it's qualified. So we're told, to namarupa charitadi sukirtananu smrityo kramena rasana manasi niyoja, that we should hear, we should chant always about Krishna, but at the same time, we should be circumspect with what we hear, what we chant about Krishna. We should always remember Krishna's pastimes, but at the same time, we're also enjoined that we shouldn't prematurely remember Krishna's pastimes. We shouldn't artificially remember. So, it's a confusing situation almost. Some things we should hear, some things we want to hear, some things we shouldn't hear right away. It's like, but our acharyas and Srila Prabhupada, just as expert doctors, they've given us a means to do so, a method to do so. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was mentioning, he was even more circumspect in some ways than Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada came to the West, and obviously there's no, mainly Gaudiya Math was composed of Bengali devotees. a great majority of whom were, most of the followers were in Bengal and had some exposure to Lord Chaitanya. They knew some, being from India, you know something about Krishna naturally. So there was a cultural background, in other words. So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he's reputed, famous for being circumspect with these things and discussing higher topics. But at the same time, in some ways, he would discuss it with his more advanced disciples, not so much to neophytes or just new people coming like that. Especially not for public presentation. Srila Prabhupada, he would present something, he would speak about, of course, guardedly, he would present topics of gopis, of cowherd boys, to new people who have no background in Krishna consciousness. And not right away, of course, the philosophy was there, don't get me wrong, but in some ways he was more liberal. The first disciple, just talking about Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, the first disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, or one of the first disciples, so let me see if I can pull this up. So I'll just read directly. This is one instance from Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Vaibhav regarding one of the first disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta who had taken initiation from him even before Srila Bhaktisiddhanta started the Gaudiya Math. I think he was one of the first 2 or 3 disciples. So this devotee, he thought that he should go higher in devotional life. Against his Guru Maharaj's explicit order, he wanted to read Srila Rupa Goswami's Ujjvala Nilamani, an esoteric treatise on dealings between Krishna and the gopis. Before long, he returned to his family home, where Srila Saraswati Thakur eventually received a letter stating that arrangements were being made for his marriage. Srila Saraswati Thakur sent another devotee to bring that devotee back, but to no avail. Deeply disappointed, Srila Saraswati Thakur berated himself as a fool and rascal, whose association had caused what he regarded this disciple's fall down. He cited this message to others that even senior and accomplished devotees can at any time capitulate to Maya. And he wrote a letter to this devotee later, which I won't read. This devotee had taken initiation, I don't know offhand, early 1900s, something like certainly no later than 1910, something like maybe 1905, around that age. So, and this happened shortly before Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur left this world. So he was initiated disciple directly of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta for 30 years, and he had extremely close personal association with him. It was one of his first disciples to read elevated books, such as Ujjvala Nilamani, etc. And by doing so, although he was a brahmachari, I don't believe he had taken sannyas at that point, although he was a brahmachari for 30 years, he fell down because of that, because he went against his guru's instruction. So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, generally, it's said, he forbade quoting again from Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Vaibhav, he generally forbade his disciples to read books describing intimate leelas, unless the majority of Gaudiya Math members had never even seen works such as Gita Govinda and Govinda Lilamrita. Even those sections of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita describing the intimate feelings of Radharani for Krishna were forbidden. He wanted his disciples to come to the stage of being qualified to study these works, but the qualification was high. And he spoke against the lopsided tendency towards topics and attempted enjoyment of rasa without comprehensive training in the vast philosophy underlying it. So, as I was mentioning earlier, Srila Prabhupada was a little more liberal in some ways. In some ways, it was more conservative. In some ways, more liberal. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he forbade his disciples to read sections of the Bhagavatam dealing with Rasa Lila, as well as those topics of Chaitanya Charitamrita, specifically, as well of probably the latter chapters, and also this Ramananda Samvad, specifically, I remember. But Srila Prabhupada, he gave these 4 things. Not only did he give these things, he gave elaborate purports to these things. So, in some ways, he was more liberal in presenting these things. And then, let's see. In the beginning, at least, later, when a group of Srila Prabhupada's disciples misunderstood Srila Prabhupada's presentation and teaching of these things, and focused exclusively on hearing about these topics in Los Angeles, famously known as the Gopi Bhav Club. All of us probably know that. Srila Prabhupada, his very livid reaction towards this contributed to an ethos within his society that to even mention about these things or talk about these things or speak about these things is deemed as Hajiism. So, and Srila Prabhupada himself, he later became much more circumspect in discussing these things. Just like we hear this memory from His Grace Swavas Prabhu, he tells his memory of on a morning walk in Los Angeles, some devotees were asking Srila Prabhupada something about Gopi Lila, and Swavas Prabhu, and his enthusiasm, he says, he recounts to Srila Prabhupada how he's distributing his book. He and other book distributors are distributing their books every single day, and his enthusiasm to do so. And Srila Prabhupada was very unenthused that morning walk before, and then when Swavas Prabhu told him this, or spoke to Srila Prabhupada turned to him and said, yes, this is my real disciple, and was very happy to see him. So Srila Prabhupada seemingly, he also took a more reserved stance. Famously, he said after that instance, not that instance, but this instance of the devotees prematurely discussing elevated topics, he said, first deserve, then desire. He didn't say never deserve, never desire, but he was guarded against it. So similarly to the same thing, another saying we have is, work now, samadhi later. So Srila Prabhupada, he didn't deny his followers access to the topmost attainment, that most elevated mellows of devotional service, the most elevated Jamma Karma Divyam, divine activities of Krishna, but he placed emphasis, he gave a method by which we can come up to it, always pointing to it. He placed emphasis, he wanted his followers to come to the stage of relishing, just as Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur did, but he did so by directing them towards active preaching engagements, because by doing so they'll acquire he knew they would acquire the purification to hear those topics. And one quote regarding the Rasa Lila, Srila Prabhupada says that, so by this deity worship, you'll become, by performing this deity worship, you will come to the point where you'll be able to hear and understand Rasa Lila. So the point was that Srila Prabhupada gave these things, and he wanted purification. It was necessary. Otherwise, as Mahotsa Prabhu was quoting the other day, he said that when my disciples become Sahajiya, that is even more dangerous. So Srila Prabhupada himself, he said that, so feeling separation from Krishna and engaging in the service of the Lord to fulfill his mission constitute the best example of love for Krishna. So both things are there. The separation is there, the most elevated devotional mellows, but at the same time, confidential devotees, they engage in the preaching mission. They're not existing in some dreamy situation in Vrindavan, just simply contemplating on Radha Krishna Lila. Even the Goswamis, which the stereotype may be there, but even they weren't doing that. They were doing that, but at the same time they were, how does that verse go? They were composing literatures for the benefit of the whole world. Tyaktva Nana Shastra Vichara Naika Nipano Sadharma Samstapako. To establish dharma, devotional service throughout the world, they composed these books for the benefit of the conditioned souls. So similarly too, Srila Prabhupada, he himself was situated in Vrindavan. Many Sahajiyas were coming to him in Vrindavan and telling him, why are you, you're in Vrindavan, you're old, why should you leave? You just stay in Vrindavan and continue your bhajan. And similarly too, that was the not standard, but there were many Goswamis, case Goswamis in Vrindavan, and as I mentioned, Sahajiyas. So many people living in Vrindavan at the time, living that sort of lifestyle, but Srila Prabhupada, he didn't do so. Even while he was living in Vrindavan, he was going out to Delhi to preach, and he himself was composing the first canto in 3 parts of Srimad Bhagavatam, with the idea that he'll compose those books and he'll go out and preach specifically to the West. So Srila Prabhupada, he never detached himself from this preaching mood. He never detached, although always absorbed in pastimes of Krishna, he was also simultaneously absorbed in the preaching movement of Lord Chaitanya. Because, as Srila Prabhupada said in one place, A devotee must know Krishna, and he also know what Krishna wants him to do. What does Krishna want? Krishna wants his devotees to go throughout the world. Krishna also means Lord Chaitanya, Krishna Chaitanya, to go throughout the world and preach his message. Krishna is very, just like, what is that? What is that verse? Mad Paramam Gohyam. And the, no. I'm thinking of something else. It's like 1868 or something like that. Yeah, how those verses go? That one who preaches the message of the Bhagavad Gita, there's no one more dear in this world, nor will there ever be one more. Yeah, I'm forgetting how that goes. Anyway, the English is there. That's okay. We understand that. That one who preaches the cult of devotional service, Krishna, he himself says that nobody is more dear than him. And we see that. Yeah. What's the second verse of that? What's the second verse that follows that? I just know the first line. It's something Mad Bhakti. I like half know it. I've heard it. I have no. I've just heard it from lectures. I haven't sat down with it. I'm rusty. Anyway, so the point is there. That the most confidential devotees, they preach the cult of devotional service. So similarly too, Lord Chaitanya prescribed the same thing. He wanted of his followers to go and preach the message of devotional service all throughout the world. And we see the most confidential devotees of Lord Chaitanya, they do so. Lord Srila Prabhupada famously, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, they were all in this mood of preaching this cult of devotional service throughout the world. So, confidential devotees. Let's see. Yaidam paramam kohyam. What's that? Mad bhakti abhidasyati. I'm like so rusted. Mami vashasi asamshaya. So, Srila Prabhupada elsewhere, he would say that he quoted quoting Bhaktivinoda Thakur that said the position of a Vaishnava can be ascertained according to how good of a touchstone he is. In other words, how many devotees, how many other Vaishnavas he's made in his lifetime. So somebody may be, by this statement, somebody may be engaged in hearing so much about Krishna, maybe living in a holy place, but if he's just doing it for his own benefit, he's not as elevated as somebody who spends his whole life elevating others, not only relishing those topics, hearing about Krishna, but inducing others to hear about Krishna. We see Srila Prabhupada, he made so many Vaishnavas. What caliber of a devotee he is. So Srila Prabhupada would say often this preaching work is taking up by the confidential devotees of the Lord. Famously, in reference to Haridas Thakur, Srila Prabhupada writes in Chaitanya Charitamrita that one who tries to relieve Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's anxiety for the fallen souls is certainly a most dear and confidential devotee of the Lord. And elsewhere, he says that it's the work of Krishna's confidential devotees to turn everyone into a Krishna Bhakta. If the confidential devotees do not take up the task of elevating everyone to Krishna consciousness, then who will do it? So, preaching, Srila Prabhupada would make the point numerous times, is not just something from Madhya Madhya or a lower stage of the devotional service. Preaching in and of itself is a very high-grade form of service. As just like there's the instance of Srila Prabhupada's book distributors, Rameshwar Prabhu actually, him asking Srila Prabhupada about this verse, Nikunja Yuno Ratikela Siddhya, and saying he was putting forward the idea that refers to book distribution. And other devotees in Los Angeles, they were thinking it's some sort of speculation, so he approached Srila Prabhupada with it, and Srila Prabhupada, he confirmed that actually this verse refers to book distribution, as well as Srila Prabhupada also mentioned that the press is Radharani, and the printing is the glories of Krishna. Srila Prabhupada, he numerous times he confirmed that book distribution is linked with the highest mellows of devotional service. This preaching of the Sankirtan movement is what Lord Chaitanya came to give, the Sankirtan movement, and it's what he inaugurated it, and he personally preached Nija Bhakti Yoga. He exhibited it himself. He gave the process himself. So So everything's there in these descriptions. So not only this relishment is there, but also the preaching. And by the Srila Prabhupada, he will make the point often that is two things: is Shravanam and is Kirtanam. Both things must be there. We must hear about the pastimes of Krishna, but we also must chant them. We must preach them to others. The chanting, it solidifies the hearing, and the hearing, it solidifies the chanting. They can't go independently of one another. The chanting is especially important, but chanting that's done without a solid basis of hearing is full of misconceptions. So both things are very important. So I've tried to extract what I can from this verse. Srila Prabhupada quote this so many different times, this Janma Karma Chame Divyam. And these verses go on hearing about Krishna, describing Krishna's beautiful Leela. Again, as I mentioned, we'll get a glimpse of the third canto, and then until the 10th canto, we won't hear anything else other than what's given in Srila Prabhupada's purports. So I'll end my class there, and I'll take any questions, comments, or anything anybody may have at this point.
That verse which you are telling about, that camphor.
Yeah.
That one is Chaitanya Leela Amritapur.
Amritapur. Krishna
Leela Sukhapura.
I don't know the rest.
Dui mili hoy sumadhuriya. Sadhu Guru Prasade taha ai ashwade. Sei jane madhurya prachurya. The pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu are full of nectar, and the pastimes of Lord Krishna are like camphor. When one mixes these, they taste very sweet. By the mercy of the pure devotees, whoever tastes them can understand the deepness of the depths of the sweetness.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very nice. You see that in Chaitanya Charitamrita. I mean, you wrote that with the context, but you see the Chaitanya Charitamrita is intermixed with Krishna's pastimes and Lord Chaitanya's pastimes. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would say that if all the books in the world are destroyed, if the Chaitanya Charitamrita remains, of course, at the Gita, Bhagavatam, but if the Charitamrita remains, then nothing is lost. Everything is there. So, thank you.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that the confidential devotees should be going out and preaching devotional service to the world. And
Yeah.
And so I was thinking, like, does this mean, like, when I'm on books, I should be saying, like, this is about love of God and that you should always be serving God all the time?
Oh, I mean, well, that's a practical consideration more than a philosophical one. And people are open to that. If you're speaking with somebody with faith in God, you can tell them that. If somebody's openly atheistic and they're completely like, it's best not to tell them that.
Okay.
It's just like, and it's better to trick them somehow or another. Just like a parent gives a child sugar-coated medicine or gives them medicine and tells them it's candy. So similarly, too, you can give them books on the basis of that. You can tell them whatever,
Okay.
with the idea that.
Yeah. Yeah, because usually I say, like, this is the highest form of meditation that you can, like, know
You can say that.
about.
That's fine. Yeah. Whatever induces them to take the books, as long as you're not cheating them. The only thing that Srila Prabhupada was, he said many different things. There are many quotes there. The only thing that Srila Prabhupada was against, and he said this many times, is that you shouldn't, we should be very transparent in our cause, in the sense that devotees were formerly telling people that were collecting money for kids in Bengal or like this, and the money wasn't actually going to Bengal. So the only thing that Srila Prabhupada said not to do in this regard was to just lie to people to get their money and use it for something that's not actually being used for. In other words, like that. So, but other than that, you can do anything to get them to take a book because it's for the benefit.
Okay, thanks. Hare Krishna.
Anything else? Koki Prabhu has something.
Hare Krishna. But just I'll just read one thing. But the beginning, you were talking about that you know, that we have to have some understanding of like Krishna and his pastimes and also Lord Chaitanya. Otherwise, you know, it's like, you know, you explain that very clearly. Like we're in it, but then we don't like know who Lord Chaitanya is. But you actually see that with Srila Prabhupada is with his early followers, that none of them like understood.
Yeah,
who
they didn't
Krishna
have a
was,
clue.
and things like that. But they, one thing at least there's like different verses in the Chaitanya Charitamrita which talk about, because then one may like read and like, you know, hear about Krishna and read about Lord Chaitanya, but not understand. But anyways, just some small comment. But there's verses that explain that, you know, by constantly like hearing and like that, then one understands from hearing, you know, because it's at least with like Lord Chaitanya's pastimes, they're much more complex than Krishna's pastimes, and they're actually much more confidential because they're hidden in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Lord Chaitanya mentioned the Chana Avatar. Then even these verses that directly mention Lord Chaitanya, they can be interpreted to be like talking about like, you know, well, there's some that like directly mention like was this Krishna Varnam Tusa Krishna, but then this Mahapurusha Charanada Vindam, the Acharyas, some interpret that as like, well, I mean, it has meant Lord Ram and Krishna, but anyways, it just meant that. Yeah, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but that's but he's hidden in that sense. So, anyways, just a small comment.
Yeah, it's a good point. Also, by hearing the literatures, the books over and over again, it gets new realization and new insights. Just Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, he himself makes that point that, I don't know the Bengali, but he says you should hear Chaitanya Charitamrita daily. Srila Prabhupada translates as Nitya, I think is the word that's used regularly. What is that? Do you know the translation? Or rough translation? Anyway, that's there. They should regularly hear Chaitanya. Same thing for the Bhagavatam, Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya. Same thing for Bhagavad Gita. Srila Prabhupada said you should study Bhagavad Gita every single day. So, I mean, of course, there's Bhagavatam class, and I was reading one quote earlier. Srila Prabhupada was saying 2 hours, 3 hours. That also includes classes. Srila Prabhupada will count. He will include those things, but by hearing the books over and over again, we get new realization and new insight into what's there. Even Srila Prabhupada's, I mean, not only, it's not just the Bhagavatam itself, Srila Prabhupada's purports, they also give newer and newer insight, actually. You see, you know, read the Bhagavad Gita. You could have read the Bhagavad Gita so many times, each time you read it, it's like you find it's something in Srila Prabhupada's purports that it seems like you completely missed or didn't understand before. Srila Prabhupada, in reference to Nectar Devotion, he said that you should read it over and over again, and then you'll come to the point of, then you'll start to understand it. So, you know something?
You were mentioning how Srila Prabhupada, he published these esoteric books early on in the movement, like TLC in 68 and Krishna Book in 70. I didn't quite catch what's the significance of that, or if you mentioned like why he
did it. Well,
esoteric books at first.
He did it. Well, multiple reasons why he did it. Presumably, Krishna book, there's a direct statement that he wanted to give. He came to give knowledge of Krishna. If he didn't give knowledge of Krishna, he gave knowledge of Krishna in Bhagavad Gita, preliminary science of God, Srila Prabhupada said, as preliminary. He didn't give the full thing is in there, full pastimes of Krishna. So he wanted to give that, especially Krishna book. 1967, he had a heart attack, and then his health was poor, and so he fearing his time in the world was short, he gave these literatures with the idea that even if I pass away, my disciples can continue on the movement, and they'll have everything. Even if I haven't translated the Bhagavatam in full, at least they'll have the essence of it. Even if I can't get to the Chaitanya Charitamrita, at least they can understand who Lord Chaitanya is, what his teachings are, etc., like that. So that's why he did like that. So,
I myself don't know what the Gopi Bhav Club is. Maybe
Gopi
you could tell a
Bhav
story.
Club, so 1975, do you know the year? I think it was 75. I forget. Actually, I think it was 76, because I think it's there in Transcendental Diary. I'm not sure. Do you know? Do you remember? Yeah, I think it was either 75 or 76. I don't think it was 74. But anyway, it must have been 75, 76, because Chaitanya Charitamrita was coming out. It was 75. Oh, 76. Oh, okay, so that's there in the Transcendental Diary. I think I must have read about that. Anyway, so this is during or after all these books of Chaitanya Charitamrita are coming out. I don't think you've read that yet. So Chaitanya Charitamrita goes, you've read Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, right? Yeah, so it goes pretty high. And that's like a small section. Chaitanya Charitamrita, it goes pretty high. It's like shocking in some places, actually. So all these books were coming out, and I mean, even Chaitanya Charitamrita itself, it goes high, and then it quotes from so many different words. I was quoting Ujjvala Nilamani. Chaitanya Charitamrita, there's verses in there from Ujjvala Nilamani, as well as Govinda Lilamrita. So many esoteric words. So all these things these books are coming out at that time. And of course, this verse is there that nectar instruction was already out. This one should hear and chant always about the pastimes of Krishna, specifically following in the footsteps of the resident of Vrindavan and like that. So some disciples misunderstanding the teachings of Srila Prabhupada, they started exclusively reading. They formed a club, actually. With the idea that, and it was a lot of devotees. It was like something like 40, 50 devotees in Los Angeles. I think there were like 200. There were 100 devotees there in Los Angeles at the time. And they will come together and read the esoteric parts of Krishna book, of Nectar Devotion, of Chaitanya Charitamrita together, and not the other parts of Srila Prabhupada's books, with the idea that by reading these portions of the books, then it's called Gopi Bhav Club, with the idea that I don't think they referred to themselves as that. They were kind of given that name, almost as a derogatory term. Although it's not derogatory, but imposed on in a sarcastic kind of way. They were given that name. They didn't call themselves that, but with the idea that they were cultivating Gopi Bhava. They were cultivating the emotions of the gopis, and their idea was that by hearing these topics exclusively, I'll begin to remember these in my mind, and I'll begin to advance in this way. Like that, more or less. And so they took some parts of Srila Prabhupada's books, and they didn't read from the other parts of Srila Prabhupada's books. So Srila Prabhupada got word of this. The devotees told them of this. The conversations are all there. I think I've read it in Transcendental Diary, just not coming to my mind. Srila Prabhupada was very displeased with what was going on there. He said that, yeah, you can. He actually, it's recorded. It's recorded. There are others as well. There are two. He was there. There were 2 or 3 leaders. Srila Prabhupada met with them. There was a room conversation, and Srila Prabhupada was very heavy in that room conversation.
Why that heaviness came? Because there was a statement called stating that Arjuna is less than Yashoda, and Yashoda is less than gopis. So this so-called material parallels of hierarchy was going on in the minds of the devotees, and they were making statements like that it is there in Prabhupada's books. They were saying like that. It's there in Prabhupada's books, so why should we read? And then Prabhupada, it might be there. Prabhupada was giving example of, in that room conversation you can hear Prabhupada was giving example of, there's so many medicines in the medical shop. It's not that you can take any medicine, whatever you want to take. And just like the child, he is also having the genitals, but if he'll hear about sex, he will spoil his life. Mm-hmm. So he will wait until he is attained puberty or something like that. Prabhupada will explain that. So the main thing was Arjuna and Yashoda are lower than the gopis. Yeah. This is what is the statement, and pregnancy also happened. There was
some conception like that as well. Just Bhagavad Gita in general is like lower.
Yeah, Bhagavad Gita is lower.
Yeah, they were thinking like that.
Even you can hear Pradyumna Prabhu's memories, in which he explains something about all these things. Pradyumna Prabhu mentions this.
So that's it in like essence, more or less. Anything else from the men?
Hare Krishna. So just in regards to what Girish was saying, so we would consider like Bhakti Rasarita Sindhu and Teaching of Lord Chaitanya like esoteric literatures?
Well, not necessarily. There's certainly more, how to say it? They give a higher understanding of devotional service than Bhagavad Gita, certainly. Everything's there in Bhagavad Gita, but it goes more explicitly. I mean, there's some verses in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, actually, if you see just like this. I don't want to quote it, but some of the esoteric verses that are given in Chaitanya Charitamrita with Ramananda Samvad, they actually come and they're quoted in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. And as well, there's other things there. A glimpse, not so much, mainly because there's a whole other work that Ujjvala Nilamani, the whole other work is there dealing with Madhurya Rasa, but some things are there, certainly. So as well. I mean, even today, I know people or know of devotees who they read Nectar Devotion just like this. They read Nectar Devotion, specific parts of Nectar Devotion with this mistaken idea that it will cultivate some sort of feelings like that in a strange manner. I mean, it's not as more esoteric than the base literatures, we can say like that, and there are some esoteric verses there, but generally it's meant for everyone as well. And especially the way Srila Prabhupada has presented it is like, you can't you can't go mistaken reading it like that. So
Yeah, I mean, there's also too, like, I mean, you can kind of do that with the Bhagavatam also.
yeah,
There's
same thing.
Bhagavatam
Yeah,
chapters.
Bhagavatam is also
devotion.
esoteric, depending on what. Like,
Yeah.
say what? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One thing I guess my understanding of like Srila Prabhupada like introducing like Bhakti Rashmita Sindhu and teaching Lord Chaitanya early on is that those texts, the Bhagavad Gita, the Bhagavatam, teaching Lord Chaitanya Charitamrita, like because that wasn't out yet, and then Bhakti Rashmita Sindhu, specifically those 4 texts define like a Gaudiya Vaishnava, and those are like the
they're
main
very important,
scriptures by
These
which
4
we
books
follow and
are
understand everything.
sufficient, Srila Prabhupada would say.
Yeah.
And especially this Nectar Devotion, this is sort of my like philosophical speculation, but it seems pretty valid. Srila Prabhupada translated that more with the intention of the first ocean, first division, meaning the science. I mean, Srila Prabhupada, he gave them himself he gave it that subtitle, the science of devotional service, which is given, the 64 limbs of devotional service, all the offenses to be avoided, etc., like that. Srila Prabhupada's disciples, they were reading one translation by Ban Maharaj,
Yeah, I was about to mention that.
which he only translated that section, the first division that just deals with the stages of devotional service. So, but of course, Srila Prabhupada, he gave the whole thing. So, presumably, writing that in 67, he translated it more with the intention of, I mean, of course, it's very essential, but at least at that point in the movement, probably translating more with the intention that initial section was very important for his disciples to understand like that. The whole thing is important, of course, but yeah. And teaching the Lord Chaitanya, obviously, the philosophy of Lord Chaitanya is like, Srila Prabhupada makes the point in the introduction that what's in this book and what's in Bhagavad Gita is non-different. And that book picks up, the teachings of Lord Chaitanya begins where Bhagavad Gita leaves off. So just develop, of course, the philosophy of Lord Chaitanya was also already there in Srila Prabhupada's purports, but just developing that in full was very important. There's so many reasons I can speculate on why Srila Prabhupada gave those books, but yeah, it's like you said, they're very essential to go to Vaishnavism. You have something? Krishna Krishna, bro?
Kalki Prabhu was asking that. Actually, these books in Prabhupada, which they gave us, these books are enough. Bhagavad Gita, Chaitanya Charitamrita, and Bhagavatam, and Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, but specifically these esoteric pastimes. If these esoteric pastimes Prabhupada wouldn't have given, we didn't know actually why Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came. At least the glimpse of this, the esoteric is there. Oh, this is actually the shore. Okay, from shore we can know the whole ocean of what is the highest thing. Unnatojjvala rasa, we can't know. Of course, Goswamis have given so many literatures, but at least even to chant the Tulsi Arati, what to speak of that? Tulsi Arati is the so high, Jugala Priti, it's all esoteric actually. The whole Shishtashtakam last verses are all esoteric. But to make us know, okay, this is what is highest, we should aspire for. But it is difficult. No, your quality is Cheto Darpana Marjanam. You are still, Sansara Dava. You are in the. So, to make us understand all these things, if you Prabhupada wouldn't have given, it is only for highest, then many devotees, they left Krishna consciousness.
Yeah.
They left and they went to somewhere else thinking that prema is there. They mistakenly thought like that and they left a movement.
It still goes on actually.
It's still going on. People say that, book distribution, it is only to engage Westerners in something, This is not important. Prabhupada gave the seed. These are all the comments they are coming. Because Prabhupada gave the seed, now we should develop into a tree. These books, book distribution will not. So that's why devotees had to be explained. This is not. Prabhupada gave everything. So you are not qualified for that. In Vrindavan, if you go, I was taunted and tortured by so many people coming from giving us Vilapa Kusumanjali, Radha Rasa Rasadhanidhi, and I don't know, so many books, and then telling, you should not be attached to Prabhupada books, you should read these things. We had to explain to them, and we had to make a big fight with them. So the point is that these all things are there to make us understand that there is that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has given. Even understanding one book like Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu or Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, this one, but it is very difficult to understand. So that's why Prabhupada has given, to make us understand that this highest is there in this. Although it is preliminary, but from preliminary you can go, so many other things are there.
Okay. I've been going back and forth, but did the Matajis have anything they'd like to add or comments? Okay, just one other thing I'd like to add on that is that even the reading of other books, Koki Prabhu was making this point to me, and it's true. The reading of other books is done so in a mood that like it accentuates or it enhances the reading of Srila Prabhupada's books. It serves as a support. Although Srila Prabhupada's books, they don't need a support, they just enhance it. It's just like, you read Lagu Bhagavatamrita, then you understand, okay, Nrsimhadev, he's like, he's one of the three, Lord Ram, Nrsimhadev, Krishna, the most complete forms of God. But everything there in Srila Prabhupada's books, it just fleshes it out more. And Srila Prabhupada, Bhaktivedanta Swami, he makes the point that the reading is done so not necessarily out of philosophical mood, but in a mood of purification. And as far as purification goes, especially for us in the Krishna consciousness movement, there's nothing more purifying than reading Srila Prabhupada's books. So it's the best thing in all circumstances.
One thing I would just tell, in Lekhamala, there is one reading guide to my disciples.
Yeah.
Everybody should read that particular one, wherein Maharaj mentions why we should read and what is the necessity of writing more books to enhance, this one point.
Okay. Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki.